The desert held its breath that morning, as if the sun itself were reluctant to rise. A pale gold ribbon stretched over the jagged ridges, glinting on dry, cracked earth, and dust hung in the air like the last strands of a spider's web. Somewhere, a lark called once and fell silent, leaving the world to its quiet, infinite waiting. She worked alone. Her hands were rough, knotted with a lifetime of labor that had never gone untested, never gone unchallenged. Broken boards lay before her, fragments of what once might have been a barn or a fence, and yet to her, they were not trash. They were tools, weapons against the cold nights, companions in solitude. She lifted one splintered board, the wood protesting beneath her fingers, and she set it down with care. The wind tugged at her hair, whipping it across her freckled face. She did not flinch. Not anymore. Years ago, flinching had come naturally like breathing. But now, she bent to the work, the rhythm of hammering and tying and setting each piece in place a language of resilience. The boards formed crooked lines under her patient hands, uneven but steadfast, a reflection of herself. Somewhere beyond the dry gullies, the first man had laughed at her, not loudly, never loudly, but in a way that still echoed, years later. He had seen only a fragment, a broken edge of her spirit, and declared it unworthy. She did not speak of him often. His memory was a shadow, a whisper of a fault that belonged to him, not her. But still, the quiet ache lingered in certain lonely hours when the sun had not yet burned all the color from the sky. Her small, makeshift shelter rose slowly, like a hesitant heartbeat. She pressed each board together, coaxed it to fit, whispered soft encouragement as if the wood could hear. The hammer's echo mingled with the whispering wind, a duet of patience and persistence. Her knees ached, her palms were raw, yet she worked with a tenderness that surprised even herself. From the ridge beyond the valley, he watched, a man of quiet strength, a rancher whose life had been measured in seasons and cattle and the stubborn patience of wind and sun. He had noticed her days ago, riding along the perimeter of his land, glimpsing her through the shimmer of heat. He had watched as she wrestled with boards, as she wrestled with herself, and he had felt something unfamiliar, admiration, threaded with a gentle worry. He did not approach. Not yet. To enter her space uninvited would be a trespass, and some boundaries were sacred, unspoken. He observed from afar, his eyes tracing the curve of her shoulders as she lifted a heavy beam, the tilt of her chin against the wind, the stubborn way she refused assistance even when the dust seemed ready to swallow her. The world, it seemed, had underestimated her, as it had underestimated so many before. But in the way she worked, in the slow, deliberate patience of her hands, he saw the truth. She was not fragile. She was not broken. She was whole, in the way a desert cactus is whole, even as the sun cracks the earth around it, even as the wind tears at its roots. Around her, the small community lingered in half-seen shapes, the occasional neighbor glancing from a distance, judgment wrapped in polite curiosity. They whispered at doorways, in doorways that faced away from her eyes, questioning the wisdom of building alone, questioning her very presence in a world that had a habit of discouraging women from solitary work. She heard them, sometimes in fragments of conversation caught on the wind, and still she worked. The rancher felt a twinge, sharp and honest, as he watched her. It was not desire. Not yet. It was recognition. In another life, he might have ridden past, indifferent, but something in the way she carried the weight of the world, without complaint, without sorrow overtaking her, compelled him to linger. His hand rested on the rail of his horse, a steady presence, a silent promise that he would remain a witness to her resilience, if nothing else. The sun climbed higher. The air shimmered with heat, and the boards reflected light in jagged, unpredictable ways. She paused for a moment, wiping sweat from her brow with the back of a sun-darkened hand. Her chest rose and fell with the effort, and she allowed herself a quiet exhale, a breath that tasted of dust and hope. In that pause, she noticed a movement on the ridge. Not sudden, not threatening, but deliberate. A figure on horseback, silhouetted against the gold of morning. She squinted, uncertain. Many men had come to judge, some to gawk, most to remind her of her supposed place in the world. She braced herself, instinct and memory guiding her. The figure did not approach hastily. It stopped at the crest of the hill, watching. No words were called. No horse snorted in impatience. Just observation, patient and respectful. Slowly, a shift passed through her, subtle and unspoken, a recognition that not all who watched came to diminish. Not all who lingered came with ill intent. She bent back to her work, hammering with renewed focus, and yet she felt the weight of those distant eyes. They were not judging, she realized. They were witnessing. And in that, a strange warmth entered her chest, fragile and tentative, like the first rays of a sun-drenched day breaking through a storm. The boards grew together under her care. Nails sank deep, beams pressed into place, and a form began to rise. Simple, crooked, imperfect, yet undeniably shelter. She stepped back, her boots leaving shallow prints in the dirt, and looked at what she had built. It was not much, but it was hers. And in the quiet of the morning, surrounded by dust and heat and the soft whisper of distant mountains, it was enough. From the ridge, the rancher nodded once, a small motion, almost invisible. His eyes lingered on her, tracing the lines of her face, the curve of her shoulders, the strength. The sun had climbed higher now, painting the valley in shades of ochre and honey. Dust swirled lazily around her boots, and the boards of her shelter creaked faintly in the warmth. She paused, wiping a smear of sweat and grime from her forehead, and let her gaze drift over the horizon. The valley stretched wide and empty, golden under the midday sun, and yet it felt full of silence, full of weight, full of memory. That was when she saw him, the rancher, a distant shape against the shimmer of heat. His horse trotted slowly, almost casually, yet there was a deliberate intent in every measured step. He was not approaching recklessly. He was cautious, respectful. He carried the quiet gravity of someone who had spent his life reading the land, reading people, reading the spaces between spoken words. She straightened, brushing dust from her sleeves. Her instincts tensed, a reflex learned long ago. Men had come before, some curious, some cruel, but this one moved differently. There was patience in his movement, a consideration she could sense even from afar. She did not speak. She did not invite him closer. She simply continued her work, hammering slowly, deliberately, as if each strike on the splintered wood could ward off intrusion. He stopped at the edge of the clearing, still far enough to give her space. From his vantage, he could see the sweat on her brow, the way her hands trembled slightly with fatigue, the stubborn set of her jaw that refused complaint. He shifted in the saddle, tipping his hat back just slightly, not as an act of arrogance, but as a quiet acknowledgement of the labor she carried alone. She felt the weight of his gaze, not oppressive, but careful, measured. Her heart quickened, not with fear, not with expectation, but with recognition. Recognition that someone could see her not as fragile, not as broken, not as a curiosity to be judged, but as she truly was, strong, deliberate, human, beautifully human in her defiance and her quiet resolve. She bent again to the boards, lifting one heavier than the last. It was awkward, unbalanced, and for a moment she nearly faltered. A grunt escaped her lips, muffled, swallowed by the wind. The rancher shifted in his saddle, a hand resting lightly on the rail, silent, steady. He could have offer help, but he did not. Not yet. There was a trust in giving someone the space to stand on her own, and he had learned, in years of watching, that the truest strength often revealed itself in solitude. Minutes stretched into hours. The world seemed to hold its breath. Somewhere in the distance, a hawk circled lazily, its shadow drifting over the valley floor. The boards began to take shape under her hands, crooked and imperfect, yet somehow alive, infused with the care she poured into them. A sudden gust of wind rattled the shelter, and she tightened her grip on the hammer. The boards groaned in protest. And then, from the ridge, The rancher's horse shifted nervously, a subtle sign of concern. It was not a grand gesture, not a hero's entrance. It was simple, silent vigilance, and it warmed her in a way that startled her. She straightened, stepping back to examine the progress. For a fleeting moment, their eyes met across the stretch of sun-baked earth. There was no rush, no hurried spark of attraction, just recognition. Two souls acknowledging each other in a world that often ignored such truths. Her hands itched to rest, but pride anchored her to the task. She would not collapse in the sight of another. Not yet. Strength had its own rhythm, its own language, and she was fluent in it. Yet, as she worked, she found herself aware of his presence more keenly than she had anticipated. Each glance toward the ridge, each tilt of his head, carried a subtle message. I see you. I see what you endure. I see the grace in your struggle. The wind brought with it snippets of conversation from the far edge of the valley. Neighbors murmured, their voices folded in concern or perhaps in veiled disapproval. She heard them and ignored them, letting their words drift past like tumbleweeds carried by the current of the wind. They would never understand this kind of strength, the quiet resilience of someone who built her life board by board, day by day, with sweat and calloused hands. The rancher shifted in the saddle again, this time closer, though still respectful of the distance she commanded. He carried a small water skin in one hand, an offering not of charity but of recognition, a bridge across the space that separated them. She caught sight of it and hesitated, pride clashing with the unspoken desire for companionship, for acknowledgement, for shared effort. She did not call out. She did not ask for it. But when the wind carried the faint scent of leather and horse, she allowed herself to glance up, and their eyes met again. There was no shame in needing a brief pause, a drink of water, a moment of relief from the sun's relentless gaze. She walked slowly to the shade of a nearby boulder and took the water. Their hands brushed, brief and electric, not in passion, but in the recognition of shared humanity, a fleeting connection that mattered far more than a grand declaration. He spoke then, softly, almost a whisper carried by the breeze. "Hot day," he said. No ceremony, no expectation, just observation, simple, gentle, honest. She nodded. "Too long without shade," she murmured. The words were soft, but they carried weight. In them was fatigue. In them was endurance. In them was the quiet acknowledgement that life, though harsh, was not without its moments of grace. They worked side by side in silence after that, though still at a distance. She hammered. He watched, occasionally adjusting a board she had struggled to position. It was slow, deliberate, careful. Neither rushed the moment, for they understood that trust, like the desert soil, required patience to take root. Somewhere in the back of her mind, she remembered the first man, the one who had rejected her, who had laughed at her attempts to be seen. He had failed to notice the subtle strength of her hands, the way she could coax life from splintered wood, the way she carried her solitude with dignity. The rancher, in contrast, did not judge. He merely watched, attentive, respectful, silently honoring her space while offering the faintest assurance of presence. The valley grew warmer, the sun climbing toward its zenith. Sweat streaked her face. The sun hung high and heavy over the valley, pouring light like warm honey across the boards of her shelter. Each beam, each nail, each scarred plank seemed to catch the light differently, as if the world itself were acknowledging the quiet triumph of her labor. She wiped her palms on her skirt and paused, surveying the crooked walls she had raised from splinters and determination. From the ridge, the rancher watched still, though the distance between them seemed less now. He had ridden back into the shade of distant rock formation and returned with a small bundle of lumber, straight, sturdy boards that promised longevity and stability, a stark contrast to the fragmented which she had wrestled with alone. His approach was careful, measured, deliberate. Every step he took seemed to whisper, "I am here, not to command, not to take, but to stand beside you." She noticed him first when a shadow crossed the sunlit ground, the silhouette of a horse moving slower now, carrying the quiet promise of aid. Pride waged war against gratitude, and she stiffened instinctively. She had managed before. She could manage again. But there was a softness in his eyes, a patience in the set of his shoulders, that disarmed her resistance without a word. "Some boards," he said softly, dropping the bundle near the base of her shelter. His voice was low, unassuming, a note in the wind rather than a call for attention. She nodded, eyes narrowed briefly in suspicion, then softened. "Thank you," she murmured, and it was the first time her voice carried something more than mere courtesy, something unspoken, something tender. Together, they lifted the boards, measured, adjusted, and hammered with care. Their movements were deliberate, almost ceremonial, each action a conversation in itself. She noticed the way his hands handled the wood, not roughly, not with impatience, but with respect, as if the material and the labor both deserved honor. She responded in kind, placing nails and planks with the same careful reverence, and a rhythm formed between them, a quiet dance that needed no spoken rules. Hours passed in a gentle cadence of work and observation. The sun shifted, casting long, dappled shadows across the valley floor. She found herself stealing glances at him, noting how the light caught his hair, the steady strength of his arms, the way his eyes never judged, never dismissed, but simply held space. And though she refused to name it, though she refused even to allow herself the thought of attraction, a warmth crept in her chest, fragile and persistent. At one point, a misaligned board slipped, threatening to topple. She caught it just in time, heart racing, and the rancher's hand was there before she could even ask. Fingers brushed as he steadied the plank. It was a fleeting touch, yet it carried weight neither of them needed to name aloud. The valley seemed to hold its breath, the wind pausing in deference, dust settling in anticipation of something unspoken but deeply felt. "Careful," he murmured. There was no reproach, no critique, only an acknowledgement of her effort and the shared responsibility of the work they had begun together. She nodded, cheeks flushed not from exertion alone, but from the intimacy of the moment. "I can manage," she whispered, almost to herself, almost as a challenge. But this time it was different. This time, someone saw her capability, honored it, and offered companionship instead of condescension. As the afternoon sun softened, painting the valley in hues of burnt gold and amber, they worked in quiet conversation. Not the chatter of idle gossip, but the soft sharing of thoughts and memories, carefully measured. She spoke of the past in fragments, hints of hardship, of loss, of rejection that had carved valleys in her heart. He listened, never interrupting, never dismissing, his presence a steady, grounding force. And in return, he shared glimpses of his own life, not tales of grandeur, but of ordinary struggles, of cattle lost and storms weathered, of long nights under vast, indifferent skies. Their words were gentle, tender, revealing the shape of lives lived close to the earth, lives etched by labor and quiet endurance. By evening, the shelter had taken a new form. Straight boards replaced crooked planks, walls held firm against the wind, and the structure itself seemed alive, a reflection of their shared labor, their mutual respect, and the trust that had grown between them in the heat of sun and the grit of work. They stood back, side by side, surveying the result. Sweat streaked their faces, dirt clung to their clothes, and yet they shared a moment of quiet pride. She glanced at him, eyes meeting his, and for the first time, a smile lingered longer than polite acknowledgement. He returned it, a slow, understanding smile that carried no expectation, only recognition. The valley was quiet around them now. The wind softened, the shadows long and forgiving. She felt a flicker of something she had almost forgotten, hope. Not hope of rescue, not hope of sudden salvation, but hope of companionship, of being seen, of standing alongside someone who respected her strength and honored her struggle. He leaned lightly against the shelter, fingers brushing the wood they had both coaxed into place. "It's steady now," he said, a simple statement, but one that held a quiet weight. Not just the structure, but her spirit, steady and resolute, recognized and affirmed. She nodded, a fragile laugh escaping her lips. Steady enough to last the winter, she murmured. And there was more in the words than mere survival. They were a promise, a recognition that resilience, when shared, could become something beautiful. The sky deepened into shades of violet and indigo, stars beginning to prick the horizon. They worked on the final touches, a crooked board here, a loose plank there, adjusting with care, laughter mingling with the rhythm of their labor. She noticed how comfortable it felt side by side in the silence and the shared focus. No grand gestures, no sudden declarations, just presence, just attention, just the slow, steady flowering of trust. When the last board was set, when the hammer fell for the final time, they stepped back together. The shelter stood upright, imperfect yet alive, a testament to persistence, patience, and the subtle power of shared effort. And for a moment, the world seemed to pause, holding its breath in reverence for the quiet triumph of two souls who had met not in romance alone, but in the grace of understanding, respect, and mutual acknowledgement. She turned to him, and their eyes met in a way that needed no words. It was the unspoken truth of recognition, of admiration, of something tender and enduring growing in the spaces between them. She felt it stir in her chest, a soft, persistent warmth that whispered of possibility. And he felt it too, in the steady pull of his gaze, the subtle, unshakable respect for the woman who had built something from nothing, who had endured, who had refused to be broken. Their hands brushed lightly once more as they both reached to steady the final plank. And in that fleeting contact, the valley seemed to hum with unspoken understanding. Even as the sun slipped behind distant ridges, the valley was filled with quiet triumph. The work was done, the shelter stood, and two hearts had begun to acknowledge one another, slow and deliberate, not rushed by desire, but deepened by the recognition of shared humanity. And in the dying light, she allowed herself a thought she had resisted all day. Perhaps she did not have to endure alone. Perhaps trust could grow alongside strength. And perhaps, just perhaps, the world might hold moments of gentleness, even in a place as harsh and unforgiving as this desert valley. The evening settled around them, soft and forgiving, the sky bleeding into shades of indigo and violet. Somewhere distant, a coyote called, and the wind carried the sound across the open land. They stood in silence for a long moment, side by side, the shelter between them both a monument not just to labor, but to connection, understanding, and the quiet blossoming of something tender. She whispered finally, as though speaking to the wind itself, "Thank you." He nodded, simple, quiet enough. "We did it together." And in that moment, as the first stars appeared above the valley, the unspoken promise lingered, that strength and gentleness could coexist, that resilience could be honored, and that hearts, slow to trust, could find one another in the quiet spaces between sun and dust, sweat and splintered wood, effort and care. The morning broke with a restless wind, tugging at the shelter they had built, rattling the boards, whispering warnings through the valley. Clouds gathered on the horizon, gray and menacing, and the air held the electric tension of a storm yet to arrive. Dust swirled in thin ribbons, carrying the scent of dry earth and the faint, acrid hint of distant wildfire. The desert, which had seemed so still, now seemed to hold its breath, waiting for what was to come. She emerged from the small shelter, her eyes tracing the clouds, noting the shift in the wind, the way the shadows crawled across the valley floor. Her hands rested briefly on the rough timber, grounding herself, feeling the warmth of the wood, the proof of their labor and endurance. But pride gave way to apprehension, for the sky above carried a warning she could not ignore. The storm was coming, fierce and untamed, and she knew that the fragile sanctuary they had built might not withstand its wrath. From the ridge, the rancher watched. He had sensed the same tension in the air, had seen it in the shift of the wind and the sudden stirring of wildlife, and now he rode forward, deliberate and swift. The horse's hooves kicked up dust as he descended into the valley, the silhouette of urgency framed against the gray sky. He carried no arrogance, no haste driven by ego, only a quiet determination to stand beside her, to protect what they had built, to honor the strength she had shown all along. The first clap of thunder rolled across the valley, low and resonant, vibrating through the boards beneath her hands. She tightened her grip on the hammer, eyes scanning the horizon. A flicker of doubt passed, fleeting, like a shadow on her heart. She was strong, she told herself. She could face the storm, but even strength alone could not stave off the fury of nature. He arrived at the shelter just as the first drops of rain began to fall, spattering dust into mud, slicking the boards they had so carefully aligned. His hands were steady as he lifted one of the heavier boards, securing it against the wind. Her hands found his instinctively as they worked together, hammering nails and adjusting timbers with synchronized precision. The storm roared, but their focus was unwavering. Lightning forked across the sky, illuminating the valley in harsh, white light. The wind tore at their clothing, whipped their hair into their faces, but they persisted. She felt the familiar ache of exertion in her arms, the strain in her back, and yet there was no fear. Not really. There was only purpose, shared labor, and the quiet thrill of survival achieved together. At one moment, a gust threatened to topple a partially secured plank. She stumbled, heart leaping, and his hands were there instantly, steadying the board, guiding hers with gentle strength. Their eyes met across the plank, rain streaking their faces, and in that gaze lay an unspoken promise. We are here, together, against whatever comes. The wind tore at the valley, shrieking through the rocks, rattling the fragile shelter, and yet in that chaos, they moved as one. She adjusted the beams, he braced the structure, and together they fought against the storm's fury, neither hesitant, neither yielding. The boards groaned under strain, nails protested, and mud turned their boots heavy, but they persisted, hearts synchronized with the rhythm of effort, the poetry of endurance. And then a lull, a momentary pause in the storm, when the rain softened, the wind held its breath, and the valley seemed to listen. They stood back, breathless, mud-splattered, exhausted beyond words, and the shelter held. Not pristine, not perfect, but alive, resilient, a testament to their labor, their persistence, and their trust in each other. The rancher's hand brushed hers once more, not in urgency, but in affirmation. She felt it, the connection deep and unspoken, stronger now than it had ever been. In the storm, they had seen each other fully, not as fragile or broken, but as partners, as equals, as souls capable of enduring together. And then the first rays of sunlight pierced through the clouds, striking the valley with golden brilliance, illuminating the dust, the wet boards, and their mud-streaked faces. The storm was passing, leaving behind a silence so profound it felt sacred. The shelter stood, battered but unbowed, and the valley exhaled with them, releasing tension, despair, and fear into the wind. She laughed then, soft and breathless, the sound mingling with the clearing sky, the wind, and the distant call of a hawk. It was not the laughter of relief alone, but the laughter of triumph, of shared struggle, of recognition that even the harshest trials could be met with courage and connection. He smiled, steady, eyes gentle, as if the storm had not shaken him at all, yet the echo of it lingered in the strength of his presence. "We did it," he said, voice low but unwavering, the simple truth carrying more weight than any grandiose declaration could. She nodded, her hand still trembling slightly from the exertion, her heart still pounding from the adrenaline. "We did," she agreed, and in that shared acknowledgement, something tender stirred between them, unspoken yet undeniable. Respect and trust had blossomed into something deeper, something patient, something real. As the last clouds drifted away, the valley bathed in sunlight once more. Dust danced in golden shafts, and the shelter, crooked yet resilient, stood as a monument not only to labor, but to courage, to endurance, and to the power of quiet connection. They sat together for a while, leaning against the shelter, mud-streaked hands brushing occasionally, exchanging glances rather than words. The world around them seemed to pause in reverence. In that moment, it did not matter what others thought, what the past had demanded, or what trials might yet arrive. All that mattered was this: two souls, tested by solitude and storm, standing together, seeing and honoring each other fully. A coyote's call echoed from a distant ridge, and the wind carried the sound like a melody through the valley. She leaned back slightly, resting her head against the timbers, and allowed herself a moment of reflection. Life had been harsh, unyielding, and often lonely. But here, in the shelter they had built together, she felt a sense of completion, not finality, but fulfillment. Strength had been honored. Effort had been shared. Connection had blossomed. He watched her, eyes softened by admiration and quiet affection. "You've built more than a shelter," he said, voice hushed, almost reverent. "You've built a place where courage and kindness can exist, where people can see each other as they are." She turned to him, gaze steady, heart warmed. "And you've helped me see that I don't have to endure alone," she said, and there was no hesitation in her voice, no false modesty. Only truth, spoken softly but with conviction. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the valley floor. Together, they secured the final loose plank, checking the shelter one last time. The wind had softened, the storm had passed, and in its wake, the world seemed brighter, more alive, more capable of holding the gentle truths they had discovered. Resilience could coexist with tenderness, strength could be shared without fear, and hearts slow to trust could find one another when the effort was mutual, honest, and patient. As twilight descended, they stepped back and surveyed the valley, side by side. The shelter stood firm, the boards catching the last rays of the sun, casting a warm glow across their faces. The rancher's hand found hers again, fingers entwining lightly, a connection born not of urgency or passion, but of shared respect, trust, and the unspoken understanding that they had endured and triumphed together. She smiled, a soft, radiant smile, the kind that comes from recognition, from being seen, from knowing that someone honors the life you have built and the person you have become. "Do you think it will hold through the winter?" she asked, not really needing an answer. He chuckled softly, warmth in his voice. "It will hold, because it's built with care, and because we built it together." The stars emerged above the valley, one by one, scattered like silver dust across the deepening indigo sky. The wind whispered through the timbers of their shelter, carrying the faint scent of wet earth and pine, mingling with the last echoes of the storm. And in that quiet, sacred space, they sat together, hands intertwined, hearts aligned, and the world seemed to honor them with a deep, abiding calm. The narrator's voice drifts then, soft as the wind. "Sometimes the world tests us, shakes us, and leaves us unsure if we can endure. But strength is not just in standing alone. It is in the courage to trust, to share effort, to recognize the worth in others. Kindness blooms in unexpected places. Love, patient and deliberate, grows quietly in the spaces between labor and endurance, in the shared triumphs over hardship. And in the end, we discover that the shelter we build together, of wood, of care, of trust, can withstand even the fiercest storms. So wherever you are, watching this story unfold, remember this: resilience matters. Kindness matters. And sometimes, the most extraordinary connections are born not from instant sparks, but from steady, enduring presence. If this story touched your heart, leave a comment, tell us where you're watching from, and subscribe to share in more tales of courage, love, and quiet heroism. And remember, even in the harshest deserts of life, there is beauty in persistence and strength in shared effort.